There is a version of Star Trek that most people have never seen. Not because it was locked away in a vault somewhere or classified by the government, but because the people making it quietly erased the rough edges, the mistakes, the compromises, and the uncomfortable truths before it ever reached your television screen. Roddenberry's influences ranged from A. E. Van Voigt's science fiction stories to C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower naval novels, and he drew heavily from the 1956 film Forbidden Planet. That original vision was ambitious, thoughtful, and deeply philosophical. It was also, according to the network that eventually heard it, completely wrong for television. When Roddenberry took his proposal to Desilu Productions in April 1964, he found a supporter in Herbert F. Solow, the studio's director of production, who signed him to a development deal. Lucille Ball, who ran Desilu, wasn't particularly familiar with the concept but played a critical role in keeping it alive during its fragile early stages. CBS was pitched first, but they passed, already developing a similar project through Irwin Allen called Lost in Space. NBC was next, and Grant Tinker, then heading the network's West Coast programming, agreed to fund a pilot episode. That pilot became The Cage, produced in late 1964 with Jeffrey Hunter playing Captain Christopher Pike. Hunter's version of the captain was serious, restrained, and deeply thoughtful, exactly the tone Roddenberry wanted. NBC hated it. Their official response described it as too cerebral, too slow, and lacking the action that weekly television audiences demanded. Even the inclusion of a female first officer, played by Majel Barrett, was considered too controversial for the era. The network rejected it outright, but in an almost unheard-of move for the time, they didn't kill the project. They ordered a second pilot instead. That decision to erase the first attempt and start over shaped everything that followed. Jeffrey Hunter walked away from the project, reportedly influenced by a belief that the show wasn't right for his career, and he was replaced by William Shatner as Captain James Kirk. Where Hunter had been restrained and philosophical, Shatner was bold, charismatic, and magnetic in a way that immediately changed the energy of the entire production. The second pilot, titled Where No Man Has Gone Before, was a success, and NBC added Star Trek to its fall 1966 lineup. Hunter never saw the cultural phenomenon his departure helped create. He passed away in 1969 at the age of 42, just as the show was being canceled by the same network that had once rejected his version of it. The original pilot, meanwhile, wasn't wasted. Roddenberry later recycled its footage into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which went on to win a Hugo Award. The transporter, perhaps the single most famous piece of technology in the entire Star Trek universe, was another invention born not from creative ambition but from financial desperation. The original plan was to have the crew travel to planets aboard shuttlecraft, which would have required filming exterior landing sequences and approach shots for every single episode. That level of production was simply too expensive for a weekly television show operating on a tight budget. The transporter effect was the solution, created by filming sparkling material falling in front of a dark background, reversing the footage, and combining it with light effects in post-production. The result cost almost nothing compared to shuttle filming and looked futuristic enough to sell the illusion completely. What became one of the most iconic visuals in science fiction history was, at its core, a cost-cutting workaround that the production team invented out of necessity. The irony is extraordinary. Today, physicists and scientists at universities around the world run experiments inspired by the concept of teleportation, and all of it traces back to a television crew that simply couldn't afford to build a shuttlecraft landing sequence. The props that defined the show's aesthetic were similarly humble in their origins. The phaser, the sleek sidearm carried by Starfleet officers that could stun, heat, or disintegrate targets, began its existence as a plastic toy ray gun pulled from the studio's inventory. The prop department took these cheap novelty items and modified them heavily, adding new paint, attaching additional components, and reshaping details to make them appear more advanced and technological. The plastic finish wasn't entirely convincing, and fans noticed it even at the time. But under the right lighting conditions, with the right camera angles and sound design, the illusion worked well enough for television audiences watching on small screens in their living rooms. The costume department operated with the same resourcefulness, regularly pulling garments from Paramount's massive warehouse of outfits from previous productions. Design was adjusted to a greenish-yellow tone that was subtle enough to suggest something alien but light enough to translate properly on black and white screens. When the show finally aired in color, the effect was so subtle that most viewers didn't even notice it. The pointed ears did most of the visual storytelling, and the reddish-skinned, vaguely demonic version of Spock was quietly erased from existence. Leonard Nimoy himself nearly walked away from the role entirely. His concerns were significant and understandable. The prosthetic ears, the unusual skin tone, the alien appearance, all of it worried him. He feared that playing such a visually unusual character might cause audiences to see him as a novelty rather than a serious actor, potentially limiting him to fringe roles for the rest of his career. The performance itself presented its own challenges. Spock required near-complete emotional suppression, a kind of acting that was fundamentally different from everything Nimoy had been trained to do. He spent a considerable portion of the first season wrestling with how to make a character who showed almost nothing feel genuinely compelling. What ultimately resolved his doubts was the audience. Viewers didn't see a monster or a gimmick. They saw depth beneath the calm exterior, genuine emotion beneath the logic. The contrast between the titles of Nimoy's two autobiographies captures his entire journey with the role. The first, published years into the show's run, was called I Am Not Spock. The second, written much later, was I Am Spock. Everything Nimoy felt about the character, the resistance, the acceptance, and ultimately the embrace, is contained in the distance between those two titles. Perhaps the most significant erasure in the entire history of Star Trek was the attempt by NBC to stop the interracial kiss between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura that aired on November 22, 1968. The episode is often cited as one of the first times an interracial kiss appeared on American primetime television, and the network fought hard to prevent it from happening in any meaningful way. NBC's proposed solution was to frame the kiss as involuntary, caused by telekinetic alien mind control, so that affiliate stations in the South could dismiss it as something that wasn't really a kiss between a black woman and a white man but rather an alien-induced accident. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols responded by deliberately ruining every take where they turned away from each other, making those versions unusable in the editing room. The production team was eventually left with only footage where they faced each other naturally, and that was the version that aired. The network got its cover story about alien influence. The audience got the real moment. Nichols later described receiving a letter from a white Southern viewer who said that scene made him fundamentally reconsider the beliefs he had held his entire life. One brief moment that a network tried to erase changed how a real person saw the world. Nichols herself had nearly been erased from the show long before that episode aired. After the first season, she decided to leave. Broadway was calling, and she submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. Then, at an NAACP event, she was approached by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who asked specifically to meet her. The unfinished underside of one of the most famous vehicles in human imagination is there for anyone who cares to look. Between seasons, Michael Dorn's original head prosthetic for Worf was stolen from the set, and Paramount never determined who took it or why. The replacement gave the production team an opportunity to redesign and improve the character's look, which they took. The stolen prosthetic became, inadvertently, an improvement. Even the show's most famous line is a fabrication. "Beam me up," Scotty has appeared on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and coffee mugs for decades. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station referenced it when James Doohan passed away. It is one of the most recognized phrases in popular culture. It was never spoken in the original Star Trek series. Not once. What Kirk actually says in various episodes are variations like "beam us up," "Scotty" or "Scotty," "beam me up" or simply "beam me up," but the exact phrase that became famous never existed. The version of Star Trek that lives in collective memory is, in this specific and rather extraordinary way, a show that no one ever actually watched. What the full story of Star Trek reveals is that the version audiences fell in love with was built on an almost continuous process of concealment, substitution, and reinvention. Noisy doors were made to sound futuristic. Toy guns were made to look like weapons of the future. Rejected pilots were recycled into award-winning television. Budget problems were disguised as visionary technology. An actress who tried to leave was persuaded to stay by a civil rights leader. A kiss that a network tried to water down into meaninglessness was preserved through deliberate creative sabotage by the actors involved. The disturbing version of Star Trek, the one that was erased, was not a single coherent thing. It was hundreds of small erasures, corrections, reinventions, and cover stories layered on top of each other across 3 seasons of television. What remained after all of that editing was a show that genuinely changed the world.